Welcome to the Good Growing Podcast. I am Chris Enroth. Again, we are here. So through snafus, just galore of technology, we are re-recording, and I am without internet. So I'm on my cell phone as we do this today. So I'm excited to try something new. You know, there's just new stuff happening every day, and we all get to learn new things. So today I'm learning how to do a Zoom podcast over the phone. But we do have a fantastic show in store for you today. Once again, we are going to be chatting with Extension Forestry and Research Specialist Chris Evans, and also the interim State Master Naturalist Coordinator. But before we get to Chris, we are going to introduce our co-hosts who are with us every single week. We are joined by Katie Parker, local foods educator in Adams County. Hello, Katie.
Hey, Chris, how's it going in Macomb today?
You know, it's best to just kind of, I'm doing okay. You know what? As a person, I'm okay. I'm doing good. How are you, Katie?
I'm doing great.
Fantastic.
No complaints here.
Well, you know who is always has a smile on his face is Ken Johnson. So Ken, a horticulture educator in Jacksonville, how are you doing today?
I am doing great. I got your email this morning and all I could do was laugh.
Yeah. The email that said the file was lost, where we were talking with Chris about maple syrup. So we are redoing the show. So folks, this is going to be the second time is the charm. We're not going to shoot for the third. We're shooting for second time on this one. But so we're going to be talking about maple syrup. And Ken, Katie, tell me, are either of you official maple syrup aficionados?
I am not. I grew up on the fake stuff, so I have not acquired the maple syrup taste quite yet.
I haven't either. We grew up on store-bought fake stuff. So it'll be good to learn about it.
Well, I'm in the same boat as you, but I would say when I started with Extension, I started working with Argyle State Park, and they tap their own trees here, and so it's a fantastic experience, and I have learned to love the real stuff, maple syrup. And so to talk with us about that today is going to be Chris Evans. So Chris, welcome to the show again.
Thanks, Chris. I'm happy to be here again.
Wonderful. And so I have to ask, when we recorded last time, we were just ending that really bad cold snap. We were down below zero, even for some of our highs for some of those days up in Northern Illinois, at least. And so you were putting out a lot of videos on Facebook regarding tree tapping down where you're located at Dixon Springs in Southern Illinois. Did that cold weather put things on hold, and how are things going right now?
It did put things on hold. Yeah, and when we can talk about that and just how weather dependent maple syrup is. But I guess the big news is the second time around, it is sunny and 60 degrees outside. So the conditions have completely changed.
So in addition to the weather conditions, being that you're in Southern Illinois, you're kind of at the furthermost or most southern part for sugar maple. Does latitude also come into play with sap quantity or quality?
It does quite a bit, and really both of those, quality and quantity, but it's still all tied back to weather, particularly the unpredictability of our weather here. Maple syrup production really relies on a gentle, slow kind of warm up in that late winter, early spring, where you have periods of below freezing and then short periods of above freezing, and it kind of gradually alternates between the two. That's when you get really, really good production, right? You get that freeze thaw cycle, and you just kind of continually recharge and get more and more sap. That's a little more predictable. That kind of slow warm up is more predictable as you move farther north. Down here in Southern Illinois and anywhere kind of in this southern edge of sugar maples, you don't get that as consistently as you do in other places. And so what happens here is we'll have periods of our winter where it'll be 50 degrees in the daytime and 40 degrees at night, and it just never gets cold enough to kind of recharge things. And so you'll have sections of the winter where you're not getting a drop of sap at all. There's nothing coming out. And then, you'll get little runs where you'll get some. So what we found down here really is that our sap comes in pulses. You'll have 2 or 3 day periods where you get really good production, kind of interrupted by longer periods where there's not much going on. And then of course, last couple weeks, it was really locked up, right? It was cold down here. We actually had 13 days where it did not get above freezing, and that is unusual for us. In those situations, nothing's happening. The sap's frozen. It's just not coming out. So we're just in a waiting period. So that all of that kind of leads to the fact that we have unpredictable sap flows and unpredictable then syrup production. So our quantity is impacted. Our quality is impacted in the same way because of those periods of warm weather. The issue with sap is you got to keep it cold. The colder, the better, because that stops bacterial growth. It stops the transfer, the changing of the sugars in the sap over, and having it cold, clear, no bacterial growth gives you that really high quality syrup. The more warm temperatures you have that syrup sits in, or that sap sits in, the kind of lower the quality can get. And so in Southern Illinois, we have to be very careful about how we handle our sap. We actually have a walk-in cooler down here. We transfer our sap in there, and it's set at 34 degrees just to try to keep our quality really high. That's some of the stuff, if you're farther north, you have to deal with a little less.
So a lot of times when people are talking about making maple syrup, typically they're using sugar maple for that. Do you guys do other types of maples, tap other types of maples? And are there any kind of taste differences between those?
So you can. We don't ourselves. We are fortunate down here that we have a lot of sugar maples in our sugar bush, and that's what we call an area you collect maple sap as a sugar bush. But no, anything that is in that genus, that Acer genus, any maple, of which there's 6 different maples that are native to Illinois, anything in that genus can legally be called maple syrup. It's all kind of at that level. I don't think there's really any taste differences. So you can get pure maple syrup out of box elder maples. You can get it out of silver maples, all the different ones. So in terms of your final product, it's not different. But in terms of the effort needed to get it out of there, there's quite a bit of difference. Sugar maples are preferred because their sugar content of their sap is often or usually higher, as well as the amount of sap they produce that you can get out of the trees is often a lot higher. And that has a big influence on kind of how much work it is to get syrup. For instance, like if you have a 2% sugar content, and that's pretty typical for sugar maples, that's where you get that 43 gallons to 1 ratio, where it takes 43 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of syrup. So that's just at the 2%. If you go down to 1%, which is a tiny drop if you think about it in sugar content, which is more what you would expect with silver maples and red maples, that number that you need to make a gallon of syrup goes up to like 86 gallons of sap. So it's just a lot more work. It's a lot more effort. They're a little more unreliable in terms of their sap flows and amount of sap you can get. All that being said, don't let it stop you. If all you have in your yard is a bunch of box elders, by golly, tap those things, because it'll make some great maple syrup.
So, okay, Chris, you mentioned a few of the native maple trees that we have here in North America. I got to ask, though, what about Norway maple? As I look at the one in my side yard, and I'm like, I would love to drill some holes in that darn sucker. And if it dies, it dies, because I don't care.
That's actually a question. I would assume yes, but I have not looked at that specifically. I do know that Norway maple, one of the kind of key characteristics to identifying it is if you break the petiole over on the leaves, it has kind of a latexy sap in it, right? The little white milky sap. So I actually do not know if then that transfers to the sap in the wood as well. So I can't say for sure, although I assume yes, you can use Norway maples.
I will experiment and I can report back. I might just top and kill the tree while I'm doing it. So we'll see how that goes.
That's quite all right.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of the Norway maple that we got here.
Yeah, you need to prune it at ground level, right?
That's right. A good basil pruning. That's what we call it. Yeah.
And then can you tap other trees other than maples, make syrup out of other trees?
You can. There's a couple other ones. So black walnuts actually are reported to be a producer. You can make syrup out of those. I tried it here last year and we didn't get a lot of production, and we just couldn't get enough sap really to make maple syrup out of it. Though I've heard that in some places where they do make black walnut syrup, it's actually the price they get for it is a lot higher than maple syrup. So I'm going to love to try it. I've committed to trying it again next year. We're going to tap a bunch of black walnuts and see if we can make some syrup. The other one people do report is sycamores, which again, we tried it one year and it didn't really work for us either. Birches is another one. And then you hear a lot about hickory syrup, but it's actually a little different. Hickory syrup, you're simply using the inner bark and you're kind of making a tea out of it, and then you sweeten the tea with corn syrup or something else. So it's more of a flavoring than a true sap-based syrup.
Historically, what was involved in harvesting sap and making syrup?
The neat thing about maple syrup is there's really not a lot of equipment needed, right? So historically, people used to use elderberry twigs or something that had a hollow pith in it, and then basically do what we do today in the sense of drill a hole in the tree or put a cut in the tree or some kind of damage, and then use the hollow twig to kind of guide the sap out into some kind of storage container. It's thought that Native Americans collected it. Early settlers certainly collected a lot of maple sap, but I think most of the time, instead of making maple syrup, especially with the early settlers, my understanding is most of the time they actually took it all the way down to maple sugar, which is basically you're just drying it and getting rid of more and more of the water. Because it's easier to transport, it's more shelf stable, it doesn't go bad as easily. And so that's another kind of product you can make out of maple sap. You can make maple candy, maple fudge, maple sugar, those kind of things. I think those were probably historically a little more common kind of with early settlers than the true maple syrup.
Kind of modern day, what kind of investment are people looking at? And if somebody has kind of a lone tree, you've kind of hinted at this, could they do this at home?
Yeah, and that's the best part. When I started in my personal journey collecting maple syrup and really became a full-on convert to, I don't even want to look at the fake stuff anymore, right? It's all about maple syrup. We started just with a couple trees. I mean, if you have one tree in your yard, you can tap that tree and all you really need, the only kind of specialized equipment that you need is a spile. And so a spile is that insert you put into the hole that you drill in the tree that guides the sap out. And historically, those were kind of rolled metal spiles. You've probably seen those, and you just boil them at the end of the year to clean them with a hook on them to hang a bucket. Nowadays, they're usually plastic. But anyway, they cost between 40 cents and a couple dollars per spile. And you can buy some food grade buckets and you're off to the races that way. So if you only have a couple trees, your investment is $10-15 worth of equipment and then some way to boil it down. I don't generally recommend boiling it all the way down in your kitchen because it produces a ton of steam and you'll peel your wallpaper. Most people boil it down outside with like a turkey fryer, a fish cooker kind of thing, or even better, over wood heat, right? And so I see the kind of most common thing for backyard people is to buy those like buffet servers, those kind of square pans, rectangular pans, or the big cast iron pots or something, and then actually cook them down over a fire that way. It's more fun than boiling it in your house anyway. You can sit around outside, and it's cheaper, right? And it uses wood heat.
Have to worry about bloody noses for a while though if you do it in the house.
That's right.
Your plants will love you too. Have a tropical rainforest.
That's true.
Does like cooking it over fire, does the some of that wood smoke, does that flavor translate to the syrup itself sometimes?
Sometimes. So if you don't have a good closed system, you'll get ash a little bit and things like that in there. I would probably recommend trying to avoid that as much. You know, if you get a little bit, it might have a little bit of a smoky flavor, but it's pretty easy to get it off flavored by getting a little too much ash in there. But really the heating is necessary, because that's really where your maple flavor comes out in maple syrup, in the sense is as you're heating it up, you're caramelizing those sugars, and that enhances the flavor. And that's a big part of the flavor you get from maple syrup. If you could concentrate the sugars other ways, and there are a lot of other ways to concentrate them, you can get it thick and sweet, but you miss a lot of the flavor without having the heat, which is what you need.
Chris, I'm kind of curious about some of the systems out there too. Like, oh, I think it was last year we were driving around and we saw these, like, I think they're blue bags, like stuck on the sides of some of these trees, just in like a fence row.
Mm-hmm.
And I assumed that was maple syrup. Maybe it's an invasive species collection, but I was thinking maple syrup. Am I right in that regard?
You are. So that's a newer technique that people have, and it's super inexpensive. So they're called sap sacks. And so there are food grade plastic sacks that you zip tie onto a PVC, kind of a round piece of PVC, and then you drill a hole in that. And so it's just, instead of buckets, it's basically a little bit more of a closed system. One of the problems with buckets is, you know, squirrels or moths or something may get into them. So these just kind of help keep your sap a little cleaner. They're pretty inexpensive, and you just throw the bag away and put a new one on the next year. We started with buckets. We've done some of those sap sacks, and we've kind of moved to what most people do that have more than 10 or 15 taps nowadays, which is tubing. So we have kind of flexible tubing, and we run everything together. All of our taps kind of coalesce those tubes downhill into a storage tank, and then that's kind of how we collect it. It's a lot easier than walking tree to tree collecting sap.
So how many feet of tubing would you have?
A lot. It depends on your system. So professional, people that actually have kind of a commercial level, they'll have sometimes 5, 6, 7 miles of tubing kind of strewn throughout their woods. Here, I think we have about 95 taps or something like that here, and our system probably has I don't know, about 1,000 feet of tubing, something like that. It's the nice thing about that tubing, the way it's set up is you actually leave it in the woods all year, so you don't have to re-put it up. You kind of set it up so it's stretched between the trees, and it's taut, and it stays there. And then we have a system where we pump water and cleaner up through the tubings to get everything clean and sanitized at the end of the season. And then you have a little thing where you hook your spile, so it's a closed system, and it just sits there. The next year you come, you inspect it, you fix any leaks or anything, and just tap it right back in place. So after that first year, it's not as much work putting it back out, which is nice.
So if somebody is using buckets, how often do they need to empty those?
You would want to, in an ideal situation, you'd want to empty them every day if you can. And the reason why goes back to what we talked about with weather. If that sap is sitting outside in the weather, especially if it's above freezing, it's exposed to bacteria. You're going to have impacts on the quality of the impacts of your sap impacts the quality of your syrup. So getting it out of those temperatures, processing it quickly, or putting it in a cooler is the best way. If it's really cold and you've had below freezing, sometimes the sap in those buckets can freeze, and you can get by with doing it every few days. But the more often you check it, the higher the quality your final product's going to be.
So is this something like canning, where equipment and containers must be sterile?
It is, yeah. So you keep everything as clean as possible, so you won't introduce yeast or bacteria or something like that. And then in your final product, when you're done boiling your syrup, it's kind of at that 67% sugar content, which is your target for syrup. Then you put it into sterilized jars or sterilized bottles. Again, it's a food product, so you kind of need everything to be clean, sterilized that way.
So Chris, you also mentioned being at like the southern extent for like sugar maple, and and when we look at climate change, they're talking about species migration. I know it's a pretty complicated issue, but are you seeing that affect maple syrup production, whether it's in the backyard or commercially, in your neck of the woods, or maybe even in our neck of the woods in central Illinois?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I haven't been at it long enough. I've been doing maple syrup personally 10 or 12 years now. So I haven't seen patterns in my kind of history of it, but there's definitely worries about that, particularly on the south end of its range. And with the prediction that, we're going to get warmer over time, and we're already seeing that happen, we're already at the edge of what's suitable for sugar maple. And it's only then likely that the suitability, the ideal conditions for sugar maple are going to kind of drift farther north and get away from us. So there is a worry that over time, not only will we lose the ability to collect maple syrup from sugar maples here, but we may actually start losing sugar maples as a whole species out of the southern end of its range, as it kind of it'll do well farther north because there's a lot more buffer there. But at the edge of the range, yes, it is a concern. I have heard from other syrup producers farther north that their seasonality of when they tap and when the flows are has already changed in their lifetime, in the sense that their flows are getting a little earlier now. It's warming up earlier than it has in the past. And so that's, again, it's changing things, and also just kind of the uncertainty of the weather. Like we had 2 weeks that was locked down cold right here. It just makes it more unpredictable, so we don't know what's going on. So yeah, it's a big concern for syrup producers.
What's your do you have like a company name
The company name?
for your syrup production?
Oh, no. So for me personally, it's just we eat all of our syrup. My kids are voracious in terms of the syrup that we consume so much syrup at our house. It's embarrassing.
Are you guys related to Buddy the elf?
That's right. But we do a lot. Most of the syrup we do now is actually here with the Ag Center. So we do it with the university demonstration.
Right.
Yeah, so it's kind of fun.
That's cool.
But we're planning this year, we wanted to do a maple syrup breakfast. And it just didn't work out for us because of COVID and everything. So we've stocked up on maple syrup, and hopefully next winter we'll hold a maple syrup breakfast here as an event.
So how long will maple syrup keep? Is it something like honey where it's forever, or does it eventually go bad?
Pretty much indefinitely. Yeah. So it'll keep a long time. One of the things about it, which is interesting though, is if it's exposed to the sun, so if you have glass containers, put it in, and it's in the light, it'll actually darken over time. And so the color of syrup is part of the grading of syrup. So you get light amber, dark amber, all these different grades. And so it can actually change somewhat the quality rating of the syrup. So most people either store their syrup in opaque bottles, right? So that you can't see through it, or they store them in boxes and things in the glass that way, just to kind of keep the quality up. But no, once it's if you hit that 67% sugar content just right, it should be fairly stable that way. If you go higher than that, it tends to crystallize. If you go lower than that, it can spoil a little easier.
So when do you typically put taps out?
So that varies depending on where you're at. For us here in Southern Illinois, our season can start, depending on the year, sometimes as early as mid-December even. We were doing some forest management stuff here and cutting trees, including maples, in December, and the sap was already running. For us, at the Ag Center, we typically tap that first day we come back from the holiday break. And we actually just pulled our spiles yesterday. So our season just finished up.
Well, that was a lot of amazing information on maple syrup. So, Chris, thank you so much. But we are also a question and answer show. So we must ask you, Chris, could you please help us answer some of these questions that came in? Maybe not necessarily about maple syrup, but some forestry related questions.
Sure. Sounds fun.
Awesome. Well, Ken, I think we have you down this week to kick it off. So if you wouldn't mind starting us off, please.
Will do. So our first question comes from Warren County, and a landowner would like to set up some type of profitable timber. They're looking more toward their kids utilizing this investment. What do you suggest?
That's a question you get a lot, right? So people want to use timber as an investment. It's a fantastic long-term investment. So the answer to that landowner really kind of depends upon what they have right now. And so if they have existing forest in place, what they want to do is get an inventory of that forest, get an assessment of what they have, what trees are there, and then look at what kind of management steps they need to do to kind of guide those trees into the most profitability into the future. I'm guessing by the way it was worded that they probably don't have any forest at this point, and they're looking at just planting forest on the ground so that when their kids, get of age, they'll have some income from that. If you're looking at planting forest, the biggest thing you can do is understand your soils, understand what grows best in the conditions that you have on your land. There's always the temptation from landowners. They want to plant walnuts. Everybody's heard about how valuable black walnuts are and how they're wonderful trees, and they are when they're grown in the right conditions. So if you plant walnuts in heavy clay or something like that, that it's not the right soil conditions, they're not gonna yield good quality timber, and they're not going to be a good investment. So you need to figure out what soil you have on your land, and choose the trees that grow best in those soils that are also good timber producers. Here in Illinois, black walnut definitely. Our oaks, particularly our white oak, is a really good timber value tree, as well as maples. Sugar maple is a very good timber value tree as well. Cherry in the right condition can be as well. So understanding what that is, really the best way is to get a consultant forester that from your area that knows the local conditions, know what grows best, and can evaluate your soils or your standing forest.
Another thing I've noticed too is the people don't want to thin trees out. You plant them really densely at first, and then it's like, okay, you got to go in after a few years and you actually got to cut some trees down and thin them out. Now I've seen actually some people have lucked out if they planted some ash in with their forest plantings. So now the ash are dying, it's kind of opening it up a little bit, but don't forget, thin those trees out, because you can get some pretty puny stands if you have all that competition happening.
Yep, yeah, absolutely. And so you want that competition at first. So what you want to do is to get quality timber, if you're talking about timber products, so a value in timber, it's all based on a straight, clear log. So a straight tree with no limbs, for 8 or 16 or more feet. That's where you get your money from trees, right? So having them close together at first does a couple things. It encourages them to, one, kind of race to get to the top, right, to get above each other. So they tend to grow straight and tall, and it also creates a little more shade at first, so that they're going to prune those lower limbs, kind of by their own, naturally prune those, and that's kind of getting you that straight limb-free trunk. But you're absolutely right, Chris. At a point, then that competition becomes too great. They become stunted, and there's not enough energy to go around to maintain all of those trees at the density that it was planted when it was young. They start suffering. They don't grow as much, and there's a lot of issues. So you need to thin them fairly regularly, but it takes somewhat of an eye to know, when they've reach the point where they need to be thinned and when they are allowed to grow. Because if you thin them too early, then they get those side limbs, they don't self-prune, and then you get knots and other defects in the logs.
So our next question comes from McDonough County, and a landowner has cleared out a black walnut patch from his woods and would like to plant edible walnuts, preferably English walnut. What does he need to know about planting edible walnuts?
It's a good question. First, I'll definitely say that black walnuts are edible, so I don't want people to think that they're not. And actually, we collected a bunch of black walnuts. My family did this year and processed them, and they're delicious in ice cream, right? Their black walnuts are fantastic. They are a little harder to handle. You'll get your hands stained, and they're a little hard to get the nut meat out. So if you are interested in English walnuts or something else, again, if your soil is right for those plants, that can be a great food product, a great nut tree to plant. The main difference is, and it goes back to what we just talked about with timber trees, where you grow them kind of tight at first and you're trying to make them have a straight, clear trunk, free of limbs for a long ways. It's really the opposite conditions when you're looking at nut production trees. You want them ideally to be a little shorter. You want to have a well-developed crown, large canopy there that has the maximum potential to produce nuts. And so in that case, you're looking at your spacing at your planting nut producing trees much wider than you would otherwise. So look at that, look at kind of what the recommended spacings are for the trees that you plant. And also sometimes you need to make sure that the trees you get will, if you only do one or two, sometimes you have to get another one that can pollinate it. I know pecans are that way. You have to get a couple varieties. So just kind of do your homework, but just realize that your spacing is going to be different. The way that you prune them is going to be different. The way you kind of care for the land will be different in a nut production versus a timber production stand.
And I can attest to that. The black walnuts will stain. Our neighbor's got a tree that likes to drop walnuts in our yard, and we collected them one year and decided I'd take all the holes off by hand without gloves, and my hands were stained for quite some time after that.
Oh, it does not come off. Absolutely.
Yes, wear your gloves if you're going to do that.
Yep.
Learn from my mistake. So our next question comes from Knox County. A vegetable grower has some old Austrian pines that are dying and they need to rebuild their windbreak. They would like to include plants that also contribute to their farm with edible crops for harvest. Do you have any suggestions for them?
Yeah, I do. And I love that question. I love that approach to managing your land. Is dual purpose, kind of how you can get things out of it. And there's a couple trees or couple plants that I would recommend. And I guess to start with, I like windbreaks that are multi-level. So instead of just having one big evergreen tree, I like having taller trees, mid-sized trees, and shrubs kind of in a level, growing together for a windbreak. I think you get a lot of value, and it tends to maintain itself pretty easily when you have those multiple levels. So I would look at, especially that shrub layer, doing things like hazelnuts. Hazelnuts are a great food crop that grows really well in Illinois. We have some of the hybrid American and filbert hazelnuts on my land. They do really, really well. So that's one I think you can plant in that shrub layer as a component of your windbreak that can be a really good producer. The other may be elderberries. Elderberries tend to do pretty well. They grow pretty thick. They're easy to maintain. And they're a producer of, they're a heavy producer of fruit. So those are kind of two species that I would look at adding into a windbreak if you're looking at getting some production out of it.
So our next question comes from Adams County, and their parents have just passed away and they had some walnut trees on their property. How do we determine the value of these trees? They had mentioned they're at all stages, some young and some old.
Okay, good question. Absolutely. The value of a tree depends on a lot of things, even as far as the location that tree's at and how easy that tree is to access, right? So if it's a harder tree to access, it's down a hill, it's over a cliff or something like that, the timber buyer has to take that into account because of the cost it's involved in getting that tree out of there. Also, the distance to the sawmills. The farther away you are from a sawmill that would take that tree, the more expensive it's going to be. So timber prices and the value of timber to the landowner, the person that owns the timber, is really, really specific to the individual situation. And because of that, it's hard to generalize the price of trees that somebody will get. The other thing is that the quality of a tree, right? And we mentioned it earlier. If you have a big walnut, but it's full of knots or some rot in it, it's not going to be near as valuable as a similar size walnut that's clear and straight and knot free, things like that. So really what a landowner that wants to get a sense of how much their trees are worth, whether they're walnuts or any trees, it would be getting a consultant forester, somebody in there that's familiar with the area, that regularly kind of administers timber sales, that knows the current values and knows the timber buyers, to do an assessment on your land. And so that's for a fee, but they would come in, look at your trees, look at the ones that are marketable, and look at their quality, and basically come up with a list of the trees that are sellable, marketable trees, their value, so you can get a sense of what to expect in terms of how much return on investment you can get from a timber sale. The other thing that's useful to do that is a consultant forester will actually help administer a sale if you want them to, for a fee as well, but they will then market your timber to multiple timber buyers. They can kind of mark your timber so that you're doing it you're harvesting the trees in a healthy way, so you can get the best price for the best type of harvest as well. So I strongly recommend anybody that's interested in selling trees to get a professional forester to kind of assist with that.
All right, our final question is also from Adams County. We are considering clearing some elm and black locust trees. They look to be in good shape. How do we find someone local to harvest the trees?
All right. Similar answer to the last one, in the sense that getting a consultant forester is a good idea. If that's not the route you want to take, you can look at the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. They have a website, the Forestry Division does, and it lists all the licensed and bonded timber buyers in the state. And so that's somebody that, if you just want to sell your timber and you don't want to get into a management plan necessarily, you can just contact local timber buyers that way. I tend not to recommend that, because I think generally people get a lower price that way for the reasons I said earlier. And some of it is the fact that you say they're in good condition, your trees are ready to cut. Sometimes a really good high quality tree, if you leave it, if it's the right kind of tree in the right condition for a small period of time, it'll jump in value. And that's basically as it transitions from one type of product you can get from that tree to another. For example, you could get boards out of that tree, or saw logs, out of that tree, or you could get veneer. And so a veneer product out of a tree is worth a whole lot more per board foot than just boards, basically, right? And so having somebody to help you and look at that tree and say, yes, that tree is valuable, but it's going to be 3 times as valuable if you wait 5 or 10 years, And so it just goes back to managing your forest in the context of a plan, and harvesting trees within that plan is going to be the best thing that any landowner can do. By doing that, you're harvesting them in a way that improves the genetics, improves the quality of your forest over time, so that your harvests are going to get more and more lucrative, I guess you would say, over time, because you're improving your forest over time, versus the risk of just selling your trees one time without any kind of plan. There's always the risk that you're just going to cut your best trees, and you're actually depleting your genetics, you're depleting the quality of your forest over time. And it's easy to do if you don't know what you're doing, right? So that's why getting a professional forester involved and building your forest in through a long-term management plan, I think, is kind of the best strategy for anybody that owns forest.
And I would agree. I mean, just being on some of these walks with these consultant foresters, professional foresters, it can seem so overwhelming when you're looking at several acres of woodland. Like, what do you do with this? You walk with them and you learn so much, and the plan does start to evolve in front of you, and it's so helpful. Yeah,
it is. And the other thing that happens too, I think, is getting the data. And and forestry, I think, amongst all the natural resources, forestry is probably the most data-driven kind of side of that, where they use inventory data that tells them more about the forest than you can sometimes see with your own eyes. And I've done that before. I've walked in a forest and said, boy, you really don't have enough regeneration on your oaks here. You need to do this or that. But then you actually go in and you do the plot work, and you kind of look at it and look at the data in a more intense way than just walking through the woods. And it tells you the real story, and you can really see what's going on. So I like that forestry uses data, and I think it gets it more of a scientific approach to management.
Well, that was a lot of wonderful information. Chris Evans, thank you so much for doing this again. I think we can count this in our reporting as 2 episodes, right? We can.
Oh, I am. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I would definitely would say that. Oh my goodness. But thank you so much, Chris, for being back here. And just, this is a wonderful, I love having you on. And even though we've done this twice now, I've learned more things. So thank you so much.
Happy to do it.
Well, the Good Growing Podcast is produced by Wendy Ferguson and edited by me, Chris Enroth. A special thanks goes to our co-hosts who are here every single week. Ken and Katie, thank you so much for being here once again to take us through the trials and travails of maple syrup and forestry.
Yeah, thanks, Chris Evans, for joining us. We should record every episode twice.
Right.
Our backups have backups this time, yeah.
The more you hear something, the more you'll retain it, right?
Yep.
Sure.
Yes, thanks again, Chris and Katie. Let's not do this one again next week. Let's do another episode.
Let's do something different. Yeah. So we're going to be talking with Jennifer Fishburne next week about beekeeping. And so I'm excited to be talking with Jennifer about kind of the other sweet, sticky thing that we can harvest using our natural resources, in this case, honeybees. So looking forward to that episode. Well, listeners, thank you for doing what you do best, and that is listening, or if you're watching this on YouTube, watching. And as always, keep on growing.